In the previous part, World War II erupted after Germany's invasion of Poland, and quickly the war spread like a wildfire. Every ship, such as ocean liner, cruise ship, or battleship, would be heavily affected by this war, as the number of casualties were piling on both Allied and Axis powers. Germany knows that time is running out and the Red Army is on a warpath after a failed invasion of Stalingrad, thus resulting in heavy casualties for Germany, with over 300,000 soldiers killed.
So, in the late 1944, the planning of Operation Hannibal was actually done quietly. Hitler opposed the measures of evacuating troops and civilians from Courland Pocket, East and West Prussia, and East Pomeranian offensives. It would be one of the largest evacuations by sea from the oncoming Red Army. The coordination of evacuation was entrusted to this man, Rear Admiral Conrad Engelhardt, who assembled a fleet of 22 liners, each weighing over 10,000 tons. As 1945 turns, the Soviet Red Army broke through the German defenses on the Eastern Front.
Some of the ships that were used in the evacuation were a mix of large passenger liners and freighters. Some most notable passenger liners included the Wilhelm Gustloff, the Capricorn, the Robert Ley, which is the sister ship to the Wilhelm Gustloff, and the General von Steuben, and the most notable freighter, the MV Goya. The ports of Gotenhafen, Königsberg, and Danzig became scenes of chaos as thousands of desperate civilians, many of them women, children, and the elderly, crowded onto the freezing docks hoping to escape. Soldiers, wounded and weary, filled the evacuation ships alongside them. The ships were cramped far beyond their capacity. In some cases, vessels designed to hold a few thousand carried 10 times that number. Conditions aboard were dire, as many of them faced frostbite, hunger, and the constant fear of attack.
The operation actually commenced on January 23rd of 1945, and as we're right now, it's underway. The ship's manifest actually cited originally 6,050 people on board. Now, this actually did not include many individuals who boarded the ship without being listed on the embarkation records.
At 12:30 p.m., the Wilhelm Gustloff left the port of Gotenhafen, accompanied by two torpedo boats and the passenger liner Hansa, which was carrying civilians and military personnel. They would suffer mechanical problems and they would not carry on, leaving the Wilhelm Gustloff with only one torpedo boat escort. This is the last known photograph ever taken of the Wilhelm Gustloff afloat. Now, how did I get these photos is actually a huge surprise. I just want to give a special shout out and a special thank you to Maritime History for supplying the photos of the Wilhelm Gustloff from the Historic Travels Discord server. The Wilhelm Gustloff had been fitted with anti-aircraft guns, but the Germans did not mark her as a hospital ship. Since she was transporting military personnel, she did not have the protection as a hospital ship under international records, as this move would be proven fatal.
And with the ship being overcrowded, this is also very important to bring up the four captains who were actually on board the vessel at the time of its sinking.
One is Captain Frederick Peterson, who is currently in command of the Wilhelm Gustloff. When I said he wasn't going to be left out of the story, I actually did mean it. Another is Lieutenant Commander Wilhelm Zahn, a U-boat specialist. His presence on board the Wilhelm Gustloff is crucial due to the fact the ship was sailing through the Baltic Sea patrolled by Soviet submarines. There are also two more captains that were on board the Wilhelm Gustloff. One is Lieutenant Commander Paul Friedrich Leckie, who is a naval transport officer, and another one is civilian ship captain Henrik Bertram. Unfortunately, I cannot be able to find either of those photos of them since none of them are available. Not all these captains are on the same page with each other. There were disagreements over the decision as whether which route to take to maintain a blackout. Peterson chose a route far from shore, but the issue is that the unmarked mines also brings the Wilhelm Gustloff into deeper waters, which is more vulnerable. Zahn also ordered a blackout on the ship, but the issue is the risk of collision on either being grounded near shore or accidentally collide into one of the escort ships by mistake.
And at this point, we're actually going to talk about another character in the story that is actually a submarine. This is actually Soviet sub S-13. And we're actually going to come back to the Wilhelm Gustloff. This is actually going to be brief once the sub finally spotted the ship.
S-13 is a Soviet sub during the Second World War. At first, the ship was under command of Captain Pyotr Malenkchenko. Then in 1942, he would be relieved by this man, Alexander Marinsko, while the sub was under repair after it was attacked by Finnish submarine chasers. The sub managed to escape and came back to its home port of Kronstadt. Alexander Morisco is a skilled but also a very controversial figure who had a reputation of both brilliance and impulsiveness, and his career has been marked by success but at that same time disciplinary issues, which includes insubordination and heavy drinking, to which he was court-martialed for. On the evening of January 30th, 1945, S-13 prowls through the Baltic Sea, which he was tasked to intercept any Axis ships, disrupting supply lines, and targeting evacuation vessels that are fleeing East Prussia. Then, they spotted a massive target, the Wilhelm Gustloff, carrying a mix of civilians, wounded soldiers, military personnel, and they spotted the ship due to the starboard and port lights.
Now, to set the stage of the sinking, let's look at what led to this moment. Operation Hannibal is a go. A massive evacuation from the advancing Red Army, 10,000 passengers. This is basically soldiers that are moving or wounded, civilians heavily overcrowded, making its way westward. Now, the weather at this time frame is negative 18 degrees Celsius or 0 degrees Fahrenheit with rough weather conditions. Now, what they actually do not know is that there's an undetected predator that's actually lurking underneath the Baltic.
The Wilhelm Gustloff was sailing through the Baltic and was sighted by Soviet sub S-13. At this time, Captain Alexander Morinsko maneuvered into firing position, preferably on the Wilhelm Gustloff's port side, between Grossendorf and Leba. With the navigation lights on as a guide, Morinsko identified the ship as an enemy vessel and began to stalk the ship for 2 hours. After taking the confirmation of the course and speed of the Wilhelm Gustloff, Morinsko gave the order to fire 4 torpedoes at the Wilhelm Gustloff. Each of these torpedoes will have the names and the context behind them is basically vengeance against Nazi Germany for backstabbing the Soviet Union and invading them and almost taking Stalingrad over. One would be named for Motherland. The second one is for Soviet people. Third is for Leningrad. And last is for Stalin. Unfortunately, the 4th torpedo was jammed. At 9:10 p.m., the first torpedo struck the ship's bow, to which caused watertight doors to seal off the area where off-duty crew members were sleeping in. The second torpedo hit directly at the accommodations where the Women's Naval Auxiliary, where the ship's drained swimming pool is, dislodged tiles at high speeds, causing high fatalities. 3 of the 373 women that were quartered here survived.
The location of the swimming pool is located right here amidship. Now, this swimming pool where the women were actually housed at actually has a Neptune tile mosaic. Now, when this torpedo blew through the mosaic, it actually blasted the mosaic like concrete and sent the pieces like lethal projectiles. That's why there was a huge high number of casualties that were actually in that area.
The third directly hit the engine room, crippling the power and communications, as this also traps engine workers inside the engine room with no way out or to escape the ship. The last torpedo, as I mentioned, for Stalin, was hung up in his tube on the sub and couldn't be able to be fired. Inside, the Wilhelm Gustloff is ultimately chaos and panic as the ship tilts. Water blasts through the hallways as thousands of passengers that were packed inside the lower decks were either killed or trapped below as water sprayed through, but some were actually trampled or stampeded on. Stairways caused to be bottlenecked. Seconds later, darkness would engulf the entire ship, thus making escape impossible. Stairs would be bottlenecked with frantic passengers trying to get out. Up on the boat deck, it is now a nightmare, as lifeboat davits are frozen stuck and had to be broken free, causing more time to be wasted. Only 9 were successfully launched. With each second, the list for the Wilhelm Gustloff gets worse and worse as the high starboard side lifeboats crash onto its side, causing many lifeboats to be destroyed and spilling their occupants into the cold, freezing Baltic Sea.
Now, a very similar situation actually did occur 3 decades earlier on board the RMS Lusitania, as we all know, was actually struck by a torpedo from U-20. Now, in the early minutes of the sinking, Lusitania has a very noticeable list after the torpedo impact. So, why is that? Well, when Lusitania was hit by the torpedo, it struck right around here nearly at the base of the first funnel and aft of the bridge. Basically, this torpedo actually busted through the hull like concrete. And the explosion also busted porthole glass. It also popped rivets, actually caused water new ways to access the ship. But Lusitania actually has these transverse and longitudinal bulkheads, which actually making the ship look like very similar to an ice cube tray. The coal bunkers will be along the sides, and they can actually be shut in case of a coal breach. But none of these would actually be a factor, and the ship actually entered a 15-degree list and actually steadily remained there, and then increased its list as time went by. Now, the starboard side lifeboats were actually swung out so far that you literally had to jump from the ship and all the way to the lifeboat. And this is basically a huge risk. You would also fall into the ocean as well. Now, jumping back into the Wilhelm Gustloff, we have 3 torpedoes that hit 3 different areas. One here, and another one back here in the engine area. This basically caused the water to flow freely inside. And this would also shut out the electricity basically early on, thus not allowing the watertight compartment doors to be closed electrically, plunging the Wilhelm Gustloff into total darkness. The engines also provided weight when flooding, thus adding on more and more angle to the Wilhelm Gustloff. And another factor to the Wilhelm Gustloff thing is how many passengers this ship actually has. Originally, the ship was actually designed to carry a little over 2,000 passengers and crew on board, but the Wilhelm Gustloff actually carried 5 times the amount of people that is actually on board.
40 minutes after the ship was hit by the 3 torpedoes from S-13, the Wilhelm Gustloff rolled over onto its starboard side, meaning that no more lifeboats could be lowered away, and anyone that are still inside the ship has no chance of escape or getting out. Finally, after an hour after the ship was hit by 3 torpedoes, the Wilhelm Gustloff sank underneath the Baltic Sea.
5 lifeboats were successfully launched from the ship in normal means or having to cut the ropes off. German minesweepers from the Wilhelm Gustloff were so worried that striking came to the scene, and since they were actually so worried about the possible chance of that sub actually still in the area, they started dropping depth charges, thus causing more casualties in the water. Now, the minesweepers and torpedo boats would rescue a total of 1,252 from the water, with 13 of those actually died.
The sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff left a scar on the Nazi Germany regime. An official naval inquiry was initiated aiming at Lieutenant Commander Wilhelm Zahn. 10 days after the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff, S-13 would strike again, this time sinking the SS General von Steuben, another ship that was involved in the Operation Hannibal evacuation. Just like the Wilhelm Gustloff, the ship plunged bow first and listed severely. 4,500 people died in this sinking.
In the years after the sinking, the biggest topic was that if the Russians had committed a war crime in the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff. Now, there's actually no count to how many boarded the Wilhelm Gustloff. You have to keep this in mind prior to the sinking. But the numbers of the people that died are 9,400. Keep that in mind, though, with that number. This is basically 6 times the casualties from the Titanic disaster. Now, the Wilhelm Gustloff actually had no markings of a civilian ship or a hospital ship, and basically Lusitania also gained a lot of controversy since the ship was actually considered a civilian ship at the time it was torpedoed, but the Wilhelm Gustloff actually had a history of carrying weaponry on board, which actually signified as a Navy vessel, so therefore it was basically a liable target.
All 4 captains of the Wilhelm Gustloff survived, and an official naval inquiry was initiated against Lieutenant Commander Wilhelm Zahn, having to be called by the Naval Board of Inquiry to testify his actions. He blamed the Croatian's crew a lack of understanding of given orders in German and mentioned that he didn't receive orders regarding the performance or avoidance of zigzag maneuvers since he confirmed there was no subs in the area. Basically, he said he got a phone call and had to leave. Wilhelm Zahn also described what happened after the torpedoes was hit. He noticed the ship listed at 5 degrees port and remained that way for 20 minutes until it increased and caused a panic. The wrong thing that Zahn said was that the ship ran aground to minimize panic, that it didn't do anything as the ship tilted to 25 to 30 degrees.
So, as the German Navy did convene a board of inquiry and gain the testimony of the sub-commander, there was actually little as they could have done to have a formal resolution on what happened, but unfortunately, Germany actually began to have their own downfall of their own in the Second World War, and basically the testimony was basically inconclusive.
The downfall of Germany was the Battle of Berlin, which went on from April 16 to May 2, 1945. The Red Army, United States, and UK forces were moving closer and closer, thus encircling and closing on Berlin. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler ended his life along with his newlywed Eva Braun in the Führerbunker, with the Soviet troops to block of the Reich Chancellery. On May 2nd, General Helmut Wilding unconditionally surrendered Berlin to Soviet General Vasily Chukov, raising the Soviet flag over the city of Berlin. Between May 4th and May 8th, 1945, remaining German forces unconditionally surrendered, and finally, the instrument of surrender was signed on May 8th, marking the end of Nazi Germany and World War II ends in Europe. Unfortunately, the findings of the Wilhelm Gustloff disaster never concluded due to the surrender. World War II would later end on September 2nd of 1945 entirely. Today, the wreck of the Wilhelm Gustloff rests 44 meters below the frigid waters of the Baltic Sea. Once a symbol of Nazi Germany's maritime ambition, is now a haunting reminder of the horrors of war and the lives were lost. In 1994, the wreck was designated as a war grave by the Polish government, and it is also closely monitored. Divers are prohibited from entering the ship or disturbing the site out of respect. The ship is a mass grave and a monument to the chaos of World War II. And despite its dark past, the story has prompted global discussions about complexities of war and human costs. The broken hull is a testament of the fragility of life during World War. Though it's hidden, it remains one of the most poignant symbols of loss, survival, and the enduring human spirit.